In high school, I did an independent study on utopias. I read fiction and nonfiction, and what I mostly remember learning is that there's no such thing as a utopia. In the first part of today's reading, though, it sure seems like there is, right? I mean, we hear that the people had this powerful spiritual experience, that they were of one heart and one soul, they had everything in common, there was not a needy person among them. This vision of a great utopian church is often held up as a model for us today, except no one can really quite figure out how this early community of Jesus followers made it happen. But if you're paying attention, you see that even within the utopian vision, there is contradiction. We're first told that no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but then it seems like people are selling land and houses that they possess. And Barnabas is commended for selling a field and laying the money at the apostles' feet, which is great, but the text doesn't lead us to think that he sold all of his fields, all of his property. And Peter even says to the ill-fated Ananias, "While the land remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, were not the proceeds yet at your disposal?" So it seems like everything wasn't actually held in common. Some people did claim private ownership of possessions, and that was okay. So one of the reasons I was interested to look at the book of Acts this summer and to think about our theme of being church is because the way that we function and operate as church, especially the way we worship, has shifted because of COVID-19. The old rules are gone and the new rules are in place. For some of you, it may seem like those of us planning worship and leading the church know what we're doing, but we don't. We're all making this up as we go. And that was true even more so for the earliest followers of Jesus. They were making it up. I mean, sure, Jesus had told them to love God and each other. He had told them the last would be first, and the kingdom was like a mustard seed, and he was the resurrection and the life. But Jesus never laid out a structure for the church committees or discussed the proper economic model for the church. These first Christians had to take the principles that Jesus taught them and figure out for themselves what that would look like practically in community. And they were kind of inconsistent and unclear about how it would all work, which actually feels pretty familiar and sort of comforting. Right? Everyone getting along and being of one heart and soul and having no needy people, that all seems really hard and pretty elusive, but being inconsistent and unclear, that's the church I know and love. Still, at least at this point in Acts, we have what is, if not completely a utopian image, at least a generally positive picture of the earliest group of Jesus followers. Barnabas, who goes on to be a great leader in the church and goes with Paul on all those missionary journeys, Barnabas, he might not sell all of his property, but he sells what seems to be a valuable field. He donates all the money to the community so that the leaders can distribute to each as any has need. And then, of course, we get to the highly disturbing story of Ananias and Sapphira. Just as a side note, I'm a little irritated that Barnabas' wife isn't given any credit for the good thing he did, but Sapphira's name is dragged through the mud here. But anyway, Ananias and Sapphira also sell a piece of property, and they also lay money at the apostles' feet, except though they claim to be giving all of the money, they actually only turn over a part of the proceeds. So, of course, they are struck dead in quick succession. Right, I know, it's a troubling story, and it brings up all kinds of questions about the nature of God and grace and sin and punishment and forgiveness, and those are good things for us to talk about another day. Today, I'm not so much interested in approaching this as a factual story that says something about God, but as a story that, for some reason, the writer of Acts thought it was important to include in this history of the church. My Old Testament professor used to say that the Bible is the Word of God about the nature of God and about the nature of God's people. I think that Ananias and Sapphira's story may have more to say about the nature of God's people and the church than it says about the nature of God. After the pious act of Barnabas giving all the money to the church, it's easy to read this story as one about generosity. I joked with Ryan that this was going to be my stewardship sermon. You all better send your checks to the church this week or else. Now, while generosity is an important element for the early church and for any healthy community, and while you should, in fact, send your checks to the church as you have ability, I don't think that's why the writer of Acts includes this story. I don't think this is the first century equivalent of a stewardship sermon. I think this story is here because it is ultimately a story about trust. Peter says that Ananias and Sapphira did not have to sell their property, and once it was sold, they did not have to give the money to the church. But what they did have to do, what they should have done and would have saved their lives, is to be honest with their community. And this emphasis makes a lot of sense. For any community to be healthy, the people who are part of it need to be honest with each other. That is true of communities as small as a couple and as large as a nation. When you can't trust each other, things get bad. And we've all seen it, and we are seeing it. The earliest church is in a particularly precarious position, which makes honesty and trust even more important. One thing the early followers of Jesus were known for, and sometimes persecuted for, was including all kinds of different people in their community. While the broader society maintained pretty strict divisions along class lines and gender lines and nationality lines, the church sought to form a community that was broadly inclusive and equitable. It's a noble idea and so hard to do. The wealthy elites weren't used to being on equal footing with the peasant farmers, and the peasant farmers were certainly not used to dealing with wealthy elites who actually cared about them. Women weren't used to having a public voice, and men weren't used to listening to women's voices. In essence, the early church was bringing together people who weren't used to trusting each other. They were working very hard to build that trusting community. One way they did that was by the wealthy giving generously of their wealth to care for those in need. The wealthy could say that they cared about their fellow community members, but they proved it by showing the care in a tangible way. And this kind of activity built up trust in the church. That was so essential for that early church to grow and to thrive. So this isn't about the money that Ananias and Sapphira held back. It's about the very fragile trust that they threatened in that community. The person who wrote Acts wanted to strengthen the church, and to do that, they had to assure people that those within the church were trustworthy. What better way to show that the community is trustworthy than to tell this story of liars who are dealt with harshly? Now, I'm in no way promoting harsh punishment for lying or any other bad behavior. I do, however, think it's important to pay attention to the emphasis the story places on the need for communities to be places where we can trust each other. And more than that, where we are trustworthy for each other. Especially right now when we're discussing new ways of being church and how to keep each other safe and healthy during COVID. Especially now when we're talking in earnest about racial injustice and white fragility. Especially now when we are questioning social structures and institutions in new and possibly scary ways. Especially right now, the church needs to be a community of trust, and that is trustworthy. We have to trust each other if we hope to have productive, meaningful conversations, and we need to be seen as trustworthy if we want the broader world to listen to anything we have to say. Church utopia may not be a realistic goal, but I believe we can, as a church, present a basically positive image of what it means to be followers of Jesus. We can be generous and take care of all who have need. We can be honest in our words and our actions. We can be people worthy of trust in a world searching for voices with integrity.